Hey, Mac Irish here, thanks for joining. Today we're going to look very quickly at the iPad. Normally when you do a search for the iPad, and it's one of the hottest presents to get this time of year, you get a ton of different versions of iPads in most retail sites. And it's very confusing to know what sets them apart and what's the differences between them. So today we're going to look into that, okay? So for example, on this page here, I have lots of different versions of the iPad. So, like, which one do I get and what does it do? Do I need to buy the most expensive one? That's what we're going to cover today. So let's have a look at all the different generations of iPad and what we get with them. So in 2010, to much fanfare, Steve Jobs announced the iPad. It was called the iPad, not iPad 1 or anything else like that. Although now it's referred to iPad 1 because there's so many different versions of iPad, and that's part of your confusion. Or it used to be called the iPad first generation. That's what people are calling it now. But here's an example of an iPad 1. This one is used because there's not that many out there on sale right now. But it's still a good buy, but you'll start to feel it a little bit, slower compared to the newer models, okay? So, what do you get with the iPad 1? The first thing that you should know is there's no camera on the iPad 1. Yeah, which I found surprising, but everyone's used to having cameras now in tablets, but that's not the case on the iPad 1, okay? So just be aware of that. You can get docks like this one that slots into the bottom of the iPad, and the iPad 1 uses a 30-pin connector, so that's quite interesting. You do have the option to do that. But, to be honest, if you want a camera, you're probably better off getting one built in, and if that's the case, go for the iPad 2 or above. But all iPads start from 16 gigabytes in size, then move up to 32, then 64, and then only recently has Apple announced a bigger size of 128 gig, okay? But if you're a casual browser, 16 gig should be enough for you, okay? All iPads come with Wi-Fi as standard, but this one allows you to do 3G as well. Now, if you want to know an iPad that can do 3G as well, it has this black bar going across the top of it. So that's one way of knowing that, okay? It might be a slightly different color on the white iPad. Typically, iPads come in either black or white. So, this is the first iPad here, and it uses a chip, and that helps you to differentiate it, okay? So the iPad here that we're looking at, it uses an A4 processor, and it's not Retina. So what I mean by that is the screen has a good resolution, but later on Apple doubled that resolution to make it twice as sharp, but keeping the screen size. So all iPads, although they've changed, there's one thing they have in common, which is their screen size, which is 9.7 inches. When they introduced the iPad mini, that was 7.9 inches. So you just swap 9 and 7, 7 and 9, okay? 7.9 inches is the mini, but for the iPad we're talking about 9.7 inches. And you'll see that hasn't changed during the course of time. Now let's move on to the iPad 2, okay? So the iPad 2 has a front and a rear camera as well, okay? It also has gone from an A4 processor to an A5 processor. So that means it's much more powerful, okay? But again, the iPad 2 is also non-Retina. Here you can see mention of the 9.7 inch display that it has. Okay, and here they've mentioned also that it has a standard definition camera on the front, and on the back it has a HD camera. So that's important to if you like to do FaceTime, because later on they increased again the megapixel count of the front camera, so it went from a standard to 720p, okay? And if you want to know more about resolutions, check out my HD TV buyer's guide, okay? But what that means is for people who love FaceTiming and they want to show their face in all its glorious detail, then, an iPad 3 would be good to get, or something like that, because that features, again, a step up in the front camera, okay? But this one is perfectly capable of doing FaceTime. FaceTime allows you to do communication over Wi-Fi and 3G as well if you choose to go for the 3G model, okay? So there's not much to say there about the iPad 2. It's an improvement in some way, adding a camera on the front and the back, but that's about it. A lot of people were expecting the resolution to be doubled on the iPad 2 and to go the same way as the Retina, but it didn't happen. So here we have the iPad 3. This came out last year, 2012, in March, and this is the iPad I was waiting for. It had the Retina display on it, so it had double the pixel count of the previous one, okay? So what that meant for people who like to see their text a bit sharper, who like reading a lot, it's a lot, easier on the eye. You could say that, the text is very sharp, it's in focus, you don't have to get so close up to the screen. The pixels are very tightly packed as well, so there's so much more detail and clarity going on there. And it's a great product, and it still has an outstanding screen, and you can get these now at great prices. So we've gone from the iPad 1, which is an A4 processor, then the iPad 2 had an A5 processor, and the iPad 3 had an A5X processor, okay? So the X is kind of means it's an improvement over the A5, okay? So it's a subtle improvement over the chip. Another thing to know is when the iPad 3 came out, they stopped, Tim Cook, he was in charge, he stopped calling it the iPad 3, and he just called it the new iPad. Everyone else in the world ignored him and called it the iPad 3, okay? But still, we're looking at a pretty, thick kind of product and heavy product in terms of this bezel here around it is quite big and thick, and it's quite, thick on the side as well. Okay, so next up we have the iPad 4. So, guess what? This was announced maybe 6 months later after the iPad 3, okay? So, burn. If you got an iPad 3, you're probably thinking, what the hell is going on? Why have they released another iPad in the same year? Well, Apple called this one the iPad, but they just said it's like a step up. But everyone else called it the iPad 4th generation, okay? So, again, it has the Retina display, okay? So, it gives you a really sharp screen. And now it has an A6X processor inside it, okay? And the other big difference is, firstly, the A6X is twice as powerful again as the A5X, okay? But the other significant difference about this is the actual port on the bottom. We saw earlier a 30-pin port to connect a camera if you wanted to, but this now goes for a slimmer port, which is called the Lightning dock, okay? Here's a good comparison. This is the longer 30-pin one that used to be there. Here's a good example here too, these two photos side by side. And now it's been replaced by this very tiny port here, which is great because, it means that you can put it in both sides, which you couldn't do with the previous one. So that's a big change in the iPad itself, okay? So the 4th generation put that in. But that was bad news for people who always used the old port. They had products invested, they could slot it in, put the music out through their docks, that were only compatible with 30-pin. So Apple released an adapter like this one over here, which is a Lightning to 30-pin adapter, okay? So that lets you kind of get around that. It slots into the iPad at the top, and then at the bottom it's like a 30-pin opening, so you can still use your docks and devices, okay? So that's a workaround, and in the UK it costs about £20. We've got all these generations, and, despite what's happening inside, on the outside very little has changed. That was until iPad released the iPad Air. So that's nice. They've changed the name of it now, okay? So it's called the iPad Air. So why is it called that? It's because it's much thinner and not as wide as previous models, okay? So let's have a look at that side by side. Here is the 4th generation, which we've just looked at, and the iPad Air, which has only just been released in October, less than 2 months ago, 2013. So if we look at this photo here, we can see that the iPad Air is actually quite thinner. Okay, the black bezel has been slimmed down, so it's kind of like half the size. Okay, you're not going to see any improvements on the height. The height is exactly the same, but the bezel is slimmed down in size. Okay, another thing is this operating system that it uses is called iOS 7, and it's a significant upgrade to the previous operating system, both in terms of its look and feel. And in fact, this is probably going to be what's going to be as standard on the iPads that you get, okay? iOS 7 can be run on every iPad, apart from iPad 1, which I don't think runs it that hot. And iPad 2 does run it as well, and it's a bit older, the iPad 2, but I think it still does a decent enough job on iOS 7, okay? So you don't need to worry about installs. That's not very hard. You just press the upgrade button. Although, that might be something you need to do if you get it second hand. You just press the upgrade button. But if you're getting it from the factory, direct from Apple or from a retailer, it should already come pre-installed. Okay, it's not a big deal. You just press one button and let it download, okay? Another thing to know about it is that it's actually less in size as well. Look, you can see, apart from just the bezel, physically, like the body is less wider. Another way you can tell an iPad 4 from an iPad Air and know you're getting the latest is these grills. These are the speaker grills at the bottom. Notice again the Lightning dock, which was introduced with the 4, is here, but on the iPad Air you get these grills here. It was also thought that the iPad Air would have the new Touch ID fingerprint sensor, the same as the iPhone 5S, but Apple decided not to include that. Another thing they didn't include was the ability to set up multiple user accounts, which would have been nice. So it's kind of more like a PC or a Mac where you can log in under different multiple usernames and kind of have it customized. But hey ho. The iPad Air, by the way, has got a Retina display, and it's also got an A7 chip which supports 64-bit architecture, and it also has a second chip inside which is for motion processing as well. So that just means, like, motion where you have it and you're moving it around, or it can accurately track you with GPS if you want that feature on. These are features that were in the iPhone, so that's where you're probably going to use it more, the motion processing, and see more of it. But also they say that the motion processor has benefits in terms of battery gain, so that's something you're going to see as an improvement in the iPad Air as well. With all these different versions of iPads, does Apple go and sell all of them on its website? No, that would be a bit confusing. So here's what Apple have done. They've taken a Retina and non-Retina approach, okay? So you don't get iPad 1, 3, or 4 on their website, okay? You get the iPad Air, the latest version, and you get the iPad 2, which is the latest non-Retina version, okay? So you have a choice there. Now the iPad mini, when that came out, that firstly came out and it was non-Retina, so it has the same resolution as the iPad 2, and in fact it has similar spec. So we can see here that the iPad 2 has a A5 chip, dual core, and so does the mini that's non-Retina. But the mini that's Retina is using the same chip, A7 with 64-bit architecture and M7 motion coprocessor, as the iPad Air. So the iPad mini, it's a smaller version. It's like more of a handheld version, and if you love reading books, that's a great option to get. If you want to read books with a more sharper display and you want a faster tablet, then the iPad mini with Retina is the way to go. Notice also that the iPad mini out of the box comes with a very small bezel The iPad 2, you can see even here in this photo, has a wider bezel than the iPad Air. So the iPad Air is kind of like, it's supposed to look more like the iPad Mini. So there's nothing wrong with getting an iPad 3 or an iPad 4, as they are all Retina displays, right, including the iPad Air. There are some good bargains to be had if they're available. So what you should do to look for those, if you go to the Apple Store, you can go and choose the iPad area, and you'll be able to see on the right hand side it says refurb, so you can actually see if there is a refurbished iPad 3 or 4 that's still available, because they're still around and they still offer the Retina display. Okay, so they're not gonna be as slim or as light as the iPad Air, but really they're offering you the same screen size with the same resolution at a much lower cost, okay? So the good thing about buying directly from Apple is, okay, yes, it's a refurb, but that doesn't mean it's broken or that there's anything wrong with it. And in fact, before Apple, put it back on sale, and you know how serious those guys are about their customer service, they make sure it's rigorously tested by their engineers, and it comes with a 1-year warranty on it as standard, okay? So that's a great thing. Another good thing about buying from Apple is if you do buy a new product from Apple, you can get that engraved, laser engraved and personalized on the back and the center for free, which is nice. And in terms of returns, they've extended their return period. Now, Apple have a great return period. They give you 2 weeks to return a product, even after you've unboxed it and opened it and used it, okay? So that's a really nice thing about Apple. They will allow you to actually return it if you decide it's not for you. And a lot of the time, that's where these refurbs come from. People changing their mind, or people upgrading, or people downgrading and deciding, I don't need one with this much memory, okay? One more thing to be aware of is that we now also have got, instead of just 3G, we have the faster networks available to us. Okay, so the faster networks are called LTE, which stands for long-term evolution. You don't need to get so bogged down in it, but like in the UK we have 4G, so it gives you the 4th generation, much more powerful speeds, okay? By the way, you don't have to look for an iPad with this feature in it. If you get an iPad which is cellular, it will support 3G networks, so you can use it for normal 3G signals, okay? But if you want to go down the faster route, if I get an iPad Air and it's model A1475, then that will work with these bands, and these bands are supported in all these countries. So I can get 4G and use it. If I buy one from the United States, it's good to be used here in the UK and vice versa. So the UK one will work in Arab Emirates on these supported networks that offer the faster rate, okay? So, you'll know by just looking at the back of your iPad, and you'll see the model number, okay? You don't have to go into specifics and say, oh, what's the model number of this iPad? You can just ask them, will this work with 4G? In another country. So that's it. That's your guide for the iPad and everything you ever wanted to know about the different versions and the history of it. Now go out there and buy Pad. Now if you have any more comments or questions, feel free to write them below. Thanks again for watching. I'm Mac Irish.